In the previous two lessons, we talked about unit tests, which focus on individual isolated components in your system, and they are easy to write, fast to execute, and you can quickly get feedback on the behavior of your system. Integration tests, on the other hand, focus on the integrations between the various components of your system and any external services. If I open up the Docker Compose file, you can begin to see what I'm talking about. Our system is the Bookify API, but it also has a few services that it depends on, which is a database, the Keycloak identity provider, the Seek instance for writing structured logs, and the Redis instance for distributed caching. Integration testing would involve testing the behavior of your system together with any external services. And in this case, mocking your services is simply not an option. However, we can go around this by simply using the real services. We have access to Docker, and we can spin up the services inside of Docker and connect to them from our unit tests. This would be the bare metal approach. However, I'm going to show you an approach using some libraries that can interface with Docker, and this library is called test containers. So let me look for the test containers library, and what this library allows you to do is to create throwaway container instances inside of your tests that you can use for running integration tests. Test containers also has a lot of helper libraries for the various external services you could depend on. Here's the test containers PostgreSQL library, and I'm going to go ahead and install that inside of our integration test project. Here is the Redis library. I'm also going to install that, and I'm going to look for the test containers Keycloak library, and I'm going to install that one as well. Another component that we are going to need is the Microsoft package that's going to allow us to run tests using an in-memory instance of our API, and the library that you need to install is Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC testing. So let's go ahead and install the latest version. So with all of these libraries installed, we can start to create some boilerplate that we are going to need for running our integration tests. I'm going to create a new folder called infrastructure, and inside of it we're going to create a class that will allow us to configure the in-memory instance of our web API. I'm going to call this the integration test web app factory. It's going to be a public class, and we are going to inherit from the web application factory base class, which is available in the Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC testing namespace, and this class expects an entry point into your API. In our case, the entry point is the program CS file. However, this isn't a concrete class and you don't really have a way to reference it. So the workaround for the time being is to create a public partial class called program, and you will be able to reference it from your web application factory. We're going to need to add a project reference to the Bookify API project, and now I can specify program here as my entry point into my web application factory. Now what I can do is to override any of the available methods on the web application factory class, and the one that I want to override is the configure web host method. The reason for doing this is that I can access the web host builder and call the configure test services method. This gives me access to the iService collection, and I can configure any services that I'm going to require inside of my integration tests. Before we configure our services, let's set up the container instances that I'm going to need to run my integration tests. I'll be using the test containers library, and here is what the container instance for my Postgres database is going to look like. I'll use the PostgreSQL builder, which is exposed in the test containers PostgreSQL library. I can specify which Postgres image I want to use. I'm going to use the same one as in my Docker Compose file. I'll give a name to the database that's going to be created inside of the container. I will call it Bookify, and I can also specify the username and password for the default user in my Postgres database. Finally, I'm going to call build, and this will give me back my container instance. I'm going to do the same for Redis. The setup is a bit simpler. We're just going to use the Redis builder. I'll specify the latest Redis image as the image I want to use, and I will just call build to get back a Redis container instance. And let's also specify our Keycloak container instance. I'm going to use the Keycloak builder, and this time I want to make some additional configuration. I'm going to add a resource mapping, which is just a way to map a file in my file system to another file inside of the container. The file that I'm going to map is going to be the Bookify Realm export file, so that I can import this this file when I run the import realm command on this container. Basically, when the keycloak container starts, it's going to import our default realm, similar to what we did when we were implementing authentication. You're also going to need the Bookify realm export JSON file inside of the .files folder in the test project. So I'm going to go ahead and add it to my test project. You can copy this file from the root folder in the source code. I'm also going to configure the properties on the realm export file, and I will set copy to output directory if newer. Let's go ahead and save this and close down the export file, and we can continue our integration test setup. Now what I want to do is to control the starting and stopping of my container instances. XUnit gives you a way to do this using the iAsync lifetime interface. Let's go ahead and implement this interface, and it has two methods, initialize async and dispose async. Inside of the initialize async method, I'm just going to call my container instances and start them one by one. So I'll make this an async method, and I will say await database container start async. Let's do the same for the Redis container. So I'll say Redis container start async, and I will do the same for the keycloak container by saying keycloak container start async. For the dispose async, I'm going to decorate it with a new keyword because the web application factory already implements the dispose async method, and inside of this method, I'm going to just stop my containers. So I will say await db container, and we're going to call the stop async method. Then let's go ahead and stop the Redis container. And lastly, let's go ahead and stop the keycloak container. So this will take care of spinning up my container instances at the start and at the end of my tests, and I will be able to connect to these external services inside of my integration tests. All that's left is to configure a few test services. I'm going to start with persistence by removing any registrations of the database context options for the EF Core database context. And the reason I'm doing this is so that I can register EF Core again by saying services add DB context. I'm going to specify my application DB context, and let's configure the database context options. First, I'm going to connect to PostgreSQL, and I need a connection string to this database. The connection string is obviously going to be different from the one inside of our application settings because this time we want to connect to a throwaway container instance. And how you can obtain the connection string is by accessing the Postgres container and calling the getConnectionString method. So the test containers library really makes this simple. And let's also call use snake case naming convention to match the original registration for our database context. Then I'm going to take care of my SQL connection factory, and I'm going to register the implementation as a singleton service. I'll say add singleton iSQL connection factory, and I'm just going to return a new instance of the SQL connection factory. And unfortunately, I can't see this type because it's internal inside of the infrastructure project. However, we already know how to solve this. I'm just going to add the internals visible to attribute and specify my integration tests assembly. So now if I go back to my integration tests web app factory, I will be able to add a using statement, and I can create a SQL connection factory instance. I'm going to pass it the connection string to the PostgreSQL database by calling database container get connection string. This takes care of wiring up any dependencies on the database container. Now I'm going to configure my Redis configuration. I'm going to override the setup for the existing Redis cache options instance, and I will just set the configuration property and point it to the Redis container connection string. And then the last bit that we need is to configure our setup with Keycloak. This is going to depend on the Keycloak options instance, which I defined inside of the infrastructure project. At the time, I configured the admin URL and the token URL with an init accessor that can't be changed. So I'm going to update that to set to make my test setup possible, and I'm going to use the Keycloak container to obtain the base address for the Keycloak instance, and I will configure what is the admin URL and what is the token URL. Notice that we are referencing the Bookify realm in both instances. However, these values are slightly different from what we have in our application settings development JSON. Here I'm specifying auth right after the base address to my Keycloak instance, and this is because the test containers Keycloak library is using a different Keycloak image than the one that we are using in the Docker Compose file. So the Keycloak API routes will be slightly different, but